Welcome to the Enrollment Clinic podcast. In this podcast, I sit down with David Weeks, the co founder of Sunrise International, a pioneering higher education marketing agency that specializes in connecting Chinese students with universities in the United States. We delve into the unique aspects of the Chinese international student market, exploring what makes these students stand out from the perspective of U.S. universities. David and I also navigate the complex landscape of geopolitics and discuss how these dynamics influence recruitment strategies for American institutions. Whether you're an educator, a marketing professional, or simply curious about international education, this episode offers valuable insights into the evolving world of Chinese student recruitment. The Enrollment Clinic podcast explores the dynamic world of higher education enrollment and marketing. Join us as we engage with industry experts, uncovering insights and strategies to help universities thrive in today's competitive landscape. From innovative recruitment techniques to the latest trends in international education, we cover it all. This episode is proudly sponsored by Student Growth Partners, your trusted partner in helping universities grow their enrollments through strategic marketing and admission solutions. If you enjoy this podcast, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends who might find it valuable. Your support helps us reach more listeners and continue bringing you expert insights from the world of higher education. Welcome, David.
Hi, my pleasure to join, and thank you for having me.
It's been great. I mean, you and I have been talking about this topic for a few months now, since when we first met at a conference where you gave a talk on the Chinese student market and everything that's happening there. One of the interesting things is that pre-COVID, there was roughly about 360,000 Chinese students that year here. And then when you look at it post-COVID, it's roughly about 270,000 or something like that. So there's been a quite a dramatic drop. Is that, do you think, just an effect of COVID, or are there other issues related to that drop?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I think that everyone's looking at the data that's presented by IIE, right? So there is an inherent sort of reporting lag there, right? So I think that this November we're going to see data from the 2022 to 2023 academic year. But let's not forget that China had kind of several waves of COVID lockdowns and reopenings, and the final reopening, the sort of the one that allowed flights to flight prices to stabilize, the one that ended that 2-week hotel quarantine, that only ended in January of 2023. So COVID only really truly ended in China in Jan 2023, which means that fall 2023 was the first enrollment year where the end of COVID really hits the books, if you will, and kind of enters the pipeline for the Chinese market. So I'd say that part of this has to do with, part of the enrollment drop from China certainly had to do with COVID. But I'd say that in the last year reported by IIE, we saw the number of Chinese students go from 290,000 to 289,000. Basically, it was like a 0.2% drop. So it's basically stabilized. Meanwhile, Chinese grad numbers are actually up. So I'd say that China is sort of, that slope of decline that happened with COVID has bottomed out, and I think has stabilized now. And I expect that what we'll see based on the year-on-year visa issuance data to Chinese students from the Department of State this past year is that visa issuance to Chinese students is actually up 50% year on year.
Oh, wow, okay.
So I think that you're going to see that number pivot back up. I think that 290,000 was basically the Chinese enrollment sort of bottoming out, and I think that we can expect that it's going to pivot back up. I think part of that is due to just COVID being over. I think part of that is due to other Anglophone study destinations putting up barriers to international students, things like the Canadian quota, limitations on work, authorizations for dependents in the UK. So I'd say the US is sort of stepping ahead by not walking backwards.
This year has been kind of like a pivotal year for the US to kind of jump in, because Canada, England, Australia, they're all putting kind of protectionist rules when it comes to higher education. But for some reason, I feel like we're not taking that step forward. Just like you said, we're just not moving, and that's what making us benefit from it.
One of the benefits of not having a strategy is that you can't have a bad strategy.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Now, I'll take a couple of steps back, and because I'm really interested in finding out, about your kind of higher ed journey and what led you to focus specifically on Chinese market.
Yeah, so when I was a college student, I graduated from Swarthmore College in 2010. I was interested in the intersection of the Chinese language and Chinese politics, and sort of how what's going on inside of China, China's domestic politics affects its foreign relations.
Mm,
Shortly after graduating university, I went to China to start a high school debate league, actually. So
mm,
went, inside of the campuses of different high schools in China and sort of built this sort of architecture, regional tournaments that filtered into national debate competitions, summer camps, basically working with Chinese high schools on extracurricular programming centering around English language debate. We pretty quickly realized that there was a huge appetite for this sort of programming among the sort of wave of newly opened international schools in China. But we also increasingly were approached by universities in the US who were interested in reaching English speaking
mm,
students who were interested in study overseas, especially in second and third tier cities in China. Those sort of high performing, high sort of inclination to study overseas students of those varieties in say Ningxia or Xiamen or Fuzhou, sort of
mm.
places that were a little bit more sort of farther off the beaten path of recruitment tours and recruitment fairs. There was a lot of interest among universities in reaching those students. So at my company Sunrise, we built out a separate, a unit of our company that specifically focuses on recruitment tours and social media marketing and digital campaigns, helping for U.S. universities, helping them to reach students in those sort of more emerging markets in China.
Gotcha. So you're not like a recruitment agent where you go out there, you collect applications and then send them over to institutions, right?
Right. Yeah, so
Gotcha.
so instead of being a recruitment agency where we operate on a commission basis and advise students in the college application process, instead we're more like a marketing firm that either
Mm,
runs the recruitment tours, the university gets to meet students and then sort of works with them on sort of driving them down funnel to get them to apply and eventually enroll, or sort of making that first contact through a social media campaign or a digital marketing campaign. So it's
yeah.
more about sort of generating more top of funnel leads, and then the university can follow up with and sort of drive them down the enrollment funnel in whatever way they think is most strategic.
Right.
We do also offer sort of high level strategic advice on sort of approaching the Chinese market for universities that have been in for a while and feel like they need to change gears, or to people who are new to China.
Mm,
But we don't operate on a commission basis, so there's
got
some
it.
some degree of difference
Got
there.
it. Now it's kind of interesting, right? Because a lot of these universities either have their in-house kind of social media team or marketing team, or they work with agencies that provide, social media marketing for the U.S. market, maybe even internationally. What makes China unique when it comes to marketing support?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First, obviously, there's a big language barrier, right? So content does need to be translated and localized and made
Mm,
to be sort of idiomatic to resonate with the market. There's a language barrier. There's also a big cultural barrier, right? So the way that higher ed works domestically in China is very rankings oriented. It's very test oriented, and it does strike a big contrast with the idea of finding the best fit for you among 4,000 universities and the idea of holistic admissions. So there is a pretty big difference there. But more fundamentally, is that China has a completely distinct internet ecosystem from that of
mm,
the global internet. There are some trends that they have in common, right? So a pivot towards short form video, and an evolution of search engine optimization practices. But fundamentally, China's internet ecosystem is a parallel internet ecosystem to the global internet. It's not that every foreign website is censored. It's not. It's more like the Great Firewall operating as a bottleneck, through which all data traffic flowing in and flowing out of China must go through. Some things don't make it through that bottleneck, so censored websites like Facebook or YouTube, and some do, but they just load more slowly. So it's for that reason that we help universities to register and set up locally hosted Chinese websites with locally hosted media, so photos, videos, lead capture forms, so that they don't load so slowly that the user might think that it's broken or something.
mm,
But then we also work with universities on setting up official social media presences on the major Chinese platforms. So the major ones being WeChat, Weibo, to a lesser degree, Douyin,
mm.
and Bilibili. So each of these platforms has sort of like an analog to a Western social media platform that you can compare them to, but it is I'd say, kind of a parallel ecosystem.
Gotcha. So in a way, kind of the SEO team that's working on Google is almost kind of obsolete, if they're trying to get you to get noticed in China, correct?
This is one of the unfortunate things about, this is what, makes China less of a low hanging fruit, but it's a big fruit, right? It's a big market. But yeah, your global social media presence, the number of LinkedIn followers you have, or the number of YouTube likes you have on your promo video, it doesn't really get you any brownie points in China. You kind of have to start from scratch. Now, that's not to say that your good, your content and the work and the material that you have is useless. Good
Yeah.
content is good content, but the following you have doesn't really translate into China. So if you have, a million Facebook followers, that doesn't really help you very much on WeChat. So you
Mm.
do kind of have to start from scratch in terms of building a following.
So one of I was looking at some research on kind of, Chinese students here in the US market, and I found it interesting that roughly about 55% of them, just the 10 top 15% universities in the US, right? So if I'm kind of a middle tier or kind of a regional brand name, in the South or somewhere in the Midwest, what is it that an institution like mine, for example, can do to really make a dent in that market?
Yeah, so it's certainly true that there is a concentration of interest among Chinese students in the top X, right? The top 25, the top 50, the top 100. It's also true that there are universities in that's those sort of top ranking trenches that are very aware of this and can basically use China to plug any enrollment gaps they might
Mm.
happen to have, right? And NYU can basically fill any empty slots it might have in a class with China. There's just a tremendous amount of interest. So that's true. It's also true that universities on the coasts of the US, as well as in major cities, have recovered a bit faster from COVID than universities that are, say, in the rural Midwest. But I'd say that there are two things that are worth keeping in mind. The first is that as interest from Chinese students begins to rebound after COVID, that does sort of create more of a competitive dynamic for spots in those say top 50 universities. That does require that students think more holistically and creatively about their
Mm.
options. I'd say secondly is that your degree of investment and commitment and brand awareness in China is not purely a function of your ranking, right? There's universities like Kent State that have been in China for more than
Mm.
20 years and have seen have enrolled thousands of Chinese students over 2 decades. That cumulative process of building goodwill, of people-to-people connection, the pure size of their alumni base, is one that allows that certain universities like those to punch above their weight in China.
Mm.
So for a school that's ranked, say, in maybe outside of the top 100, maybe even outside of the top 150, you can still if you commit to the Chinese market, for some schools they do well because they were very early movers in the market.
Mhm.
But if you're very present, if you visit China often, if you have a digital presence in China, and especially if you're aware of where your comparative advantages are in China, so if you have one or two or three majors or programs that tend to be very popular with Chinese students, you can carve out a niche for yourself. So it's not to say that you have no chance to recruit students, and it's purely a function of ranking if you're from a regional a smaller regional state school. It's just that you do have to commit to the market.
Mm.
It is a long-term pipeline that you have to build, and it's not something that it's not a market where you can expect recruitment to happen by osmosis. So it is harder, but I think that with a market as big as China, it's not the case that certainly many students would be interested in attending a top 50 university. I think that's true for a lot of places, but I do think that you're able to find the right product market fit in and especially by going to second and third tier cities in China, you do have the ability to find students who
Mhm.
are open to your programs.
Do you see a shift in perception mentality, from a parent standpoint in terms of like bang for the buck, right? So it's not necessarily
Mm.
just the brand, but it's also, hey, listen, a US education will set my son or daughter at a better advantage here in China. Because again, China is also investing a lot in their internal educational system, right? And actually a lot of those universities are now ranking a lot higher in Times Higher Ed yearly ranking. So do you see some of that happening?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So it's true that Chinese universities are rising in global rankings. However, that's primarily true for the top 5 or the top 9
Mm,
universities in China. Essentially, there's this organization called the C9 League, which is the top 9 universities in China.
mm,
It's basically China's Ivy League. A Those universities do tend to sop up a tremendous amount of Ministry of Education funding. And there's a couple of very steep drop-offs in terms of the quality of education inside of Chinese universities. Basically, you've got the top 5, then the top 9, then the universities that are in the Project 985 group, or the double first class group, which is about 200 universities. And then there's what are explicitly called tier 2 universities.
mm,
And with each step down, or each sort of like, with each, as you move down in the rankings, the quality of instruction, the quality of facilities, the level of investment in those programs does drop precipitously. The only thing that governs whether, what university you can get into in China is the Gaokao, which is a standardized entrance exam. So if you're a Chinese student, you are kind of rolling the dice by staying in China, in that if you get a good Gaokao score, and you're from a city like Beijing, where it's a bit easier to get into these top universities, then yeah, you might be able to access, a global top 50 ranked university. On the other hand, if you have a bad day with the Gaokao, then you might be looking at a very different option.
mm,
Retaking it is highly stigmatized. You have to wait an entire year. So on the other hand, there's one other dynamic that I'd like to speak to briefly, which is the Chinese economy. So China, I think that if you talk to, a student or a parent in 2018 or 2019, and you kind of gave them a hypothetical, you got into a university that's ranked number 49. It's a private university. Tuition costs $50,000. Your option B is a university that's a public university that's ranked number 50, where the tuition is $20,000. I
mm,
think that a good number of people would still choose the university that's number 49, even though it's double the cost, but only one ranking higher.
right.
The idea that if it's inexpensive, if the university is pitching you on the value of the degree, there must be something wrong with it. And that conversely, the more expensive something is, the more elite it is, right? I think that dynamic has really begun to slow down, if not reverse completely. And that's largely because of the Chinese economy.
Yeah.
So China's economy today looks really different from what it did in 2019. Growth rates are generally lower, and there was a very sharp period of economic recession at the end of 2022 caused by COVID lockdowns, which had sort of knock-on impacts for domestic tourism as well as global supply chains. So it really impacted China's export market. At the same time, you have sort of a crisis of confidence in China's property sector. This
Mm,
has resulted in a really significant spike in youth unemployment.
mhm,
So for a lot of China's sort of smart, for students who are graduating from undergraduate programs of all varieties in China, some students are really interested in graduate school as a way to just delay their entrance into a difficult job market, or as a way to sort of appear more competitive in a really crowded job market. There's a degree inflation where people are looking for jobs after graduating with a BA or a BS, but the only jobs that they're able to get aren't really jobs that actually require a college degree. So
mm,
getting a master's degree is a way to sort of get over
differentiate.
that
Yeah.
problem
Yeah. Yeah.
and negotiate for a better job. And that is a rising tide that has lifted the boat of both domestic grad programs as well as international programs.
So, given that kind of this pursuit of a U.S. diploma, it's more of a kind of like in-market differentiation, right? So, when I think
Mm.
of Indian students, Bangladeshi students, some of the students from South Asia, their intention is they want to come here, they want to get the 3-year OPT, right, and then hopefully parlay that into an H-1B visa and then continue staying here, right? But it sounds to me with the Chinese market, a lot of that intention is to take that diploma, differentiate yourself in the market. So does that open up the market for online degrees?
Yeah, so for Chinese students, I think that you're right. They do have eventually the intention, by and large, to go back to China. I think most students are aware that doing OPT is a good idea. Getting some overseas job experience as well as the overseas degrees, those two things put together are much more powerful than either one of them separately.
Mm,
So a lot of Chinese students, I think, are very interested in OPT, and I think that one of the US's sort of great competitive assets right now is our job market. It is very tight. People are hiring. On the other hand, it's not like people are trying to sort of pole vault that from OPT into H-1B. Most Chinese students do have the intention of going back eventually to work in China.
If the intention is to go back, right? And I'm not saying this is for everybody. The Chinese student is not a monolith, right? But if generally kind of that intention is to go back and differentiate yourself, does that open up the opportunity for U.S. institutions to push online degrees and online diplomas?
So online courses in China are quite inexpensive. And I think that there is sort of this broader issue in China of the lack of recognition of online courses and online degrees.
Mm,
So the Ministry of Education and the sub entity within that's responsible for recognizing or giving sort of awarding credit basically to foreign earned credentials, translating them into the sort of point system of academic credit that works in China. That entity doesn't really accept online programs.
mm.
It did during COVID as a sort of temporary patch, but basically, as soon as China opened the border, it gave students a couple of weeks' notice that, hey, we're not recognizing online degrees anymore, or online taught courses. So China is quite strict about the recognition of online programming, at least for academic degrees, right? So if you're doing like say a semester at a U.S. university, you're only getting credit, and then you're going back to China. You're only getting that credit for courses that are taught offline.
Got it.
Say if you're a mid-career professional and you're purely just looking to upskill, right? Learning some kind of, learning business English or something. And it's purely sort of for your own internal sort of, your own internal skill set. You're not really using this as looking for a credential to to matriculate or to convert into credit in China, then that's fine. But generally, I think that academic institutions in China don't recognize online degrees at all.
Mm,
Some employers, especially if they're state-owned enterprises, will have a more sort of kind of attached like a handicap to online programming, if you will. But of course, having a micro credential or having a certificate, even if it's taught online, from the employer's perspective, at the end of the day, either you know Python or you don't. Either you speak English or you don't. So
yeah.
I think that it is a way to demonstrate commitment to learning a particular thing or to self-improvement. But I'd say that compared to other markets, online programs do have a more limited reach in China because essentially it's only really has currency for employers and not for academic institutions.
Mm. Now, we don't have a lot of time, and I have two main questions that I want to get through. One is I would love for you to debunk the China university list. So let me just tell you a little bit more about that. So there's this you talk to different institutions and you say, hey, well, what are you doing in the Chinese market? And what you hear is, well, we can't really do anything there because we're not on the government list. Right. So tell me a little bit about this list. And
Yeah.
there is such a thing?
Yeah, so it's not quite the same as say Saudi Arabia, right? Where there's a list of approved universities or approved programs that are eligible for scholarship. So China does have an approach to accreditation, right? The organization inside of the Ministry of Education that does this is called CHESI. There is there's a list of university courses and programs that China will use to determine whether or not credit from that university can translate into credit. Say, if I earn a BA at your university and then I want to go back to China for a master's, then that's going to be an important question, right? Or if I'm going on a government scholarship, right, then I would need to go to an accredited university. But only about 10% of Chinese students do that. But yeah, essentially this matters more from the perspective of going back to China and, if you wanted to go to a master's program or something like that, or if you were doing a 1 semester long exchange and you wanted academic credit for that 1 semester. It's not, the process of, that list is, is, in large part, it's not sort of an external assessment of the university. It's really just an assessment of, are you on, whatever your regional accreditation board is here in the States, are you on that list? Are you certified, right? It's not, it's much, I'd say, lower stakes than a list in say the Middle East or something where
Yeah.
it's really going to determine whether or not the students want to go to your school at all, or are able to because of government funding. I'd say that really a lot of universities don't even think about this list until they are looking at creating a 2+2 style partnership in China, and they realize that they're standing with the Ministry of Education is important.
Right.
That
But
list isn't really a resource that students look at. It's very rare for students to do a bachelor's overseas and then a
mm,
master's back in China. Usually, the fact pattern there is reversed. So
right.
the
But
list, to the extent it exists, isn't super important.
right. I mean, it just sounds to me like as long as you have accreditation, right?
Yes.
And I would say again, we can't say regional or national anymore, but still in our minds is if you have regional accreditation, there's you're kind of already in the list, right? As
Yeah.
long as you're on NECHA's list of accredited universities, then you're probably, kind of on that list if there is such a thing. The reason why I said that is because I've been on the institutional side, and it's unbelievable how many people will come to you and say, "Yes, if you pay me, I'll get you on the list."
That has to do with sort of the business model of matchmaking between sort of universities that are looking for 2+2 partnerships. And they sort of dangle that cookie in front of you of getting on some list. The thing is that China's not like I think that China isn't really approving very many new 2+2 partnerships. A lot of the new university partnerships look very different. It's a 4+0 or something like that. So I'd say that is sort of the thin end of a wedge of introducing a model that's a bit outdated.
Wait, how does a 4+0 work?
So it would be
The
the
U.S.
students.
institution would just grant them a diploma if they finish at, Beijing Institute of Technology or something, right?
Yeah, it's not very reciprocal, right? But the
Right.
idea is that the U.S. university would provide faculty, and then there would be, but the teaching would happen entirely in China. There would be some blended online offline learning, but that would be taught inside of the Chinese,
I see what you mean by
classroom.
right.
But basically, it's. I'm sure that there are really high quality 4+0s out there. I think that it is obviously very beneficial for the Chinese university. Usually, there's some revenue sharing of
Right.
the years of tuition
I,
that are
I see
co-taught,
what.
but it's less attractive for U.S. schools, of
Yeah,
course.
it's I see actually the way I see that is kind of American institutions do satellite campuses at another institution outside of the country. Okay, and now the next question that I'm sure it's on everybody's mind is the geopolitics and the foreign policies of the two countries, how they're affecting international students, basically American students going to China, Chinese students coming here to the U.S. There was an interview that the Deputy Secretary of State gave, where he was basically insisting that what American institutions should do is actually grant diplomas in liberal arts, right? So not necessarily STEM. So allow Indian students to get the STEM diplomas and visas, and then Chinese students to actually come here for arts and humanities, right? To kind of almost use higher ed as a way to enforce foreign policy. What's your thought on that one?
So I think that there's a bit of a misconception that Chinese students only care about engineering, right? I mean, there's plenty of students who are interested in econ or in other
Right.
social sciences, and you also have distribution requirements, which oftentimes happen before you do your distribution requirements before you declare your major. Sometimes students just discover that they're actually interested in doing something other than hard STEM. I think that there's, that part of this discussion obviously is sort of downstream from security concerns about Chinese students having access to information that has some kind of national security bearing.
I said
I'd say
there
that
was an instance somewhere in the Midwest with a student, Chinese students, right, who was, in touch with intelligence services in China looking to recruit kind of agents or double agents here. I mean, this again, it's one out of 3 million students that China has sent here over the past 20 years, right? But again, I guess at that level and where we are, the U.S. and China, there is a little bit of that concern.
Yeah, and I think that I think that concern is not limited to just, oh goodness, like what happens if a Chinese student gets access to, access to, a lab that has a lot of, national security sort of connections in the substantive
Mm,
focus of its lab, and then this work makes its way back to the People's Liberation Army or something. I think a lot of this also has to do with questions about industrial espionage or commercial
mm,
espionage. There's a lot of public-private partnership between U.S. And U.S.
of course.
labs and corporations. So, yeah, I mean, I think that the essentially the Trump administration, pretty early on, passed an executive order saying that members of the People's Liberation Army, current or former members, are not allowed to study in the US. And at the same time, we also have seen that for Chinese PhD students who are focusing on certain sensitive subjects, particularly artificial intelligence, machine learning, data science, it's a bit harder to get a visa. You basically have to demonstrate that your intentions are good, and that you do have to withstand a bit more scrutiny in your visa application. That has been on the books at this point, I think, since 2017. So I think that that's kind of baked into the cake a little bit. I think that students, if they're interested in an advanced PhD in one of those topic areas, or an advanced degree in one of those topic areas, they may consider another study destination. It's also true that those particularly AI and ML, honestly, there are pretty good
Mm,
programs in China. So I'm not sure that that's really the beating heart of where student interest in study overseas is, particularly in the US. I think there's a lot of students who are interested in business and economics. I don't think that there's a very significant security risk in having Chinese undergraduate students come for, a bachelor's of science in data science. They're just not working at a level that would be
right,
sensitive. Most of the
right,
material
right.
they're engaging in is
Understood.
pretty
Yeah.
foundational. So I think this sort of national strategy, basically to squeeze the shoes of Chinese students into crowding into our liberal arts colleges. As an LAC grad, I love that idea of kind of enforcing some evenness. But most of these students are self-funding. Our university system is incredibly decentralized. If Education USA wants to talk about why a liberal arts, degree is a valuable thing in China, then sure. I mean, I don't think that that's wrong, but I think that each individual student and university can make their own decisions about, about what is, whether or not a student is qualified to study there. I think that we've kind of have blinders up, or we have sort of bumpers up against some of those security concerns and have since 2017.
Got it. So aside from, because we did talk a little bit about your marketing and social media work in the market there, but you also do tours. You've done over 200 tours in like 55 plus different cities. How are these tours organized? Are there just once a year? Is there different times?
Yeah, so we go to China a couple of times a year. We do typically one undergraduate and one graduate tour each semester, so 4 per year. There are some years where we do 5 or even 6. It's usually a group of about 20 to 25 U.S. universities. We have some of our tours that are open to universities from other countries as well. And we tend to focus on second and third tier cities, going to the campuses of local high schools or local universities to recruit on campus. So it's a little bit different from that hotel ballroom style fare where
Mm,
you end up with a lot of agents or
yeah,
a lot of
yeah,
parents of say elementary school students, and you're sort of, it's sort of like a head scratcher as to what we're doing here. It is very focused on the students who are, at international at international schools for Chinese students. And it's a bit more targeted in that regard.
got it, got it. Well, thank you so much for being here as a guest today. Where can our listeners find you?
So do feel free to get in touch. Our website is sieconnection.com. We just recently put out a white paper on sort of the landscape of Chinese international education. Some really interesting stuff there as far as China's sort of appetite for trying to get more Americans to study overseas in China and what that means for international recruiters. There are a couple of interesting impacts. We also put out another white paper on updates as far as China's digital landscape is concerned. So feel free to check out the research page of sieconnection.com. You might find some interesting stuff there. Otherwise, feel free to get in touch with us. We're always happy to provide free web presence reports in China for any university that's interested, and to walk you through how we might be able to advance your goals in China.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, David, and I'm looking forward to see what you guys do in the future.
All right.